Over my career, I've done a lot of interviews with some well-known people and some people no one's heard about before. I thought it might be fun to drag some of them out of the archives and share them here on YouTube. David Dow, one of the smoothest voices in broadcasting for years, worked for CBS, and you may have heard him doing hourly newscasts. Now in retirement, he's helping the poor in Los Angeles. I sat down with David Dow and told him that someone said to me one time that he was a hyperactive teenager.
I don't know that I was ever a quiet kid, but I grew up in a small gold rush town in Northern California, Auburn, California.
Which would put you somewhere between, what, Modesto, Sacramento, Grass Valley, up in that area?
35 miles northeast of Sacramento.
Okay.
In the Sierra foothills. County seat of Placer County, and just over the hills from Placerville, better known as Hangtown, or once known as Hangtown.
For legal reasons?
For obvious reasons, literal reasons. And Placerville used to proudly still have a hanging mannequin in the town square.
Oh, Lord. And they had their own hanging judge, I guess.
Well, and I guess back in the gold rush days they did. But to answer your question, when I was in the 6th grade, I was appointed the class reporter for the Auburn Journal, the weekly newspaper in Auburn, California. And the first time I saw my byline, I was smitten. I mean, never mind what I wrote was probably trash. When I saw that byline, it changed my life. And I began thinking at that time that someday I wanted to be in newspapers for a living. Of course, there was no television. There was radio, of course, but my mind was honed toward newspapers, and had a sort of a typical course from there. From then on, we moved to the big city, Sacramento, when I was still 11 years old, and I was editor of my high school newspaper. Went on to Stanford, to college, and worked a bit for the Stanford Daily. And when people would ask me what I wanted to do in life, or what my goal was, why I unabashedly would say, someday I want to be editor of the New York Times. Well,
which is not a bad goal.
No, not a bad goal. I've realized half that. I read the New York Times.
You're on the receiving end, not the sending end.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. And my first job out of college was a newspaper job with the San Diego Union. I was a Copley trainee, which meant that you had a year's contract, and you got to work in each of the major departments of the paper. And at that time, I was thinking I wanted to be a sports writer.
Yeah, and Copley was a pretty decent chain at one time.
It was indeed, and the San Diego Union was a well-staffed newspaper. And for example, my first boss, it turned out the day I reported they had an opening on the sports desk. So they started my rotation through the paper on the sports desk, and my first boss was Jack Murphy, who later was, of course, became the name on a football stadium, football/baseball stadium.
Yes, yes. You say that you were smitten with, after having seen your byline. I don't want to get into this too deeply, but everybody I know in broadcasting, journalism and radio, finally admits that there is an ego trip involved, for example, in hearing yourself on the air. And as much as a lot of people, including myself, don't like their own voice on the air, it still is nice. Mm-hmm. And in journalism, when I was with UPI Radio, we got both, because not only was I doing hourly newscasts and reporter reports, but we also ended up writing for The Wire when the company began to downsize. It was so funny, we could write our newscast and misspell Gorbachev for a long time until they said, what you write now is going to go on The Wire, and we all had to learn to spell suddenly. So.
Well, you see, Dennis, you were ahead of your time, because the industry, the world of journalism, has come to that point today where typically, if you got a job today, you would be doing print, online, radio, if the outfit happened to own a television station, you'd probably be doing that too.
Well, my traveling companion and I were listening to the all-news station, KNX, here in town, talking about the fact that they now have the CBS television weather people doing radio, and not all those people who look good on television sound good on radio. It's kind of the opposite of having a face for radio, you know?
Well, they are distinct media, unique media.
Yeah. But with downsizing and consolidation, you have that cross-pollination now. Mm-hmm. Where in the golden days of radio, one of my heroes was Douglas Edwards, whom I managed to spend some time with, and who used to do a show on CBS called The World Tonight. Mm-hmm. And a lot of younger people will remember before its demise, the late Christopher Glenn was the anchor of The World Tonight. But he didn't write much of it at all. He was, in essence, what the CBC in Canada would say a news reader. It always tickled me. The announcers on the CBC often would say, "The news as read by Colin Fraser." Well, that kind of blew Colin Fraser's cover as a journalist. But I'm sure he had some input in the newscast. But those days, as you say, are gone.
Well, Chris could write, and write well. I happen to know both of the talents that you cite. Chris better than Douglas Edwards, who was in his last years when I joined CBS News. Mm-hmm. But Chris I got to know quite well, and he could write and write well, but he was a master of live broadcast, and anybody who doubts that should listen to his broadcasts, of the first shuttle launch, which is just classic live broadcasting. It's just marvelous word pictures and excitement. And also, he happened to be on the air when, I've forgotten whether it was Challenger or Columbia, one of the two shuttle tragedies took place.
The Challenger disaster
took place. And that, too, has become a classic broadcast.
I have a reminiscence of being at CBS one day, and Douglas Edwards, they can't find him. It's about 20 minutes before 6, and they can't find him. And so for those who don't understand radio, the network headquarters are actually able to talk to the stations. Now they wire them, but to talk to the stations privately. It's called a closed circuit. And CBS had this wonderful system called Net Alert, which little chirps, you still hear it. Well, they sent out a Net Alert, and a staff booth announcer comes in and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to substitute Christopher Glenn, who was in the building, on The World Tonight. Please," they would tell the affiliates that it's not going to be Douglas Edwards, it's going to be Christopher Glenn. Well, the stations don't really need to know that, except the poor disc jockey will say, "Now here's Douglas Edwards, and it's Christopher Glenn." Well, anyway, about 3 minutes before 6, Douglas Edwards walks in, and he looks at the clock and looks at his wristwatch and takes his wristwatch off and drops it on the floor. He'd gone out to get his laundry. And he sits down in the booth at CBS. They send out another closed circuit saying, "False alarm, it's going to be Douglas Edwards." And he doesn't even look at the script. And there was a fellow named Richard Colson, who was the producer-director of The World Tonight. And the sounder, B-D-D-D, goes off, and Douglas Edwards looks down and says, "This is The World Tonight," and goes through the whole 15 minutes without ever reading it before that. And if I were ever impressed with Douglas Edwards before that, it showed me that if you have it and you reach that level, you could go on if the lights went out. And he, the hair stood up on the back of my neck thinking, my God, this man is doing this. And it was incredible. And you say Christopher Glenn was like that.
Oh, yes, he was. And Doug Edwards probably was the least excited person in the building. Richard Colson was probably the most excited. They were very different personalities.
Yes. Well, let's move on now. You started out as an apprentice, if you will, at the Copley paper in San Diego.
Worked there a year. The U.S. military intervened. I was something like 45 days before my draft date. I joined the Navy, spent 4 years in the Navy.
Did you see the world?
I didn't see the world, but I saw a part of it, including the privilege of sailing around Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Wow.
And made a Mediterranean cruise, and had the good fortune to be stationed almost as a plank owner, an original part of the crew of the USS Enterprise, which just recently they announced is being retired. but it was the showboat of the Navy. It was the first nuclear-powered carrier, and
what is it like to be at sea in what amounts to a little city?
Well, it is an amazing experience, and I will always think that night carrier operations, flight operations, on a carrier like the Enterprise are the greatest show on earth. They are spectacular in the age of supersonic jet aircraft. To watch aircraft get catapulted off into the night, with flaming exhaust going off into the night, and then mystically, in my mind, coming back and landing on that postage stamp, or what looks like a postage stamp.
Often heaving.
Yeah.
Yes.
Heaving postage stamp. And the pilots who do that day after day after day just have my undying admiration.
There isn't much margin for error, is there?
There is no margin for error. And there is absolutely no margin for error. And unfortunately, while I was still with the squadron that deployed aboard the Enterprise, one of our crews was lost at sea in a crash into the round down the fantail of the ship in a misgauged.
Wasn't high enough.
Was not high enough.
Crashed into the vessel itself.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I had a good friend I went to journalism school with who was badly burned and would actually have to, when he typed, hold. Have you ever seen a pencil? It's about half again thicker than a regular lead pencil, usually round with a big eraser. He would shove that in his hand and with one hand type on an electric typewriter. And I remember one day he was not in class and one of the students had a headache or something. And Professor Walker said, "Kenny types with no hands. Don't you tell me you have a headache." But he was on the deck as a deck crew when a plane came in and blew up. But you're right. I mean, I've only seen films, but I can't imagine what it would be like to be there when the thing hurtles off the deck.
Oh, it's an amazing sight. I never tired of it.
So you did the Navy. What was your position there?
Well, it was. It turned out it didn't start out this way, but it turned out it was a twofold journalistic stepping stone. It was my first exposure to television. You asked what it was like on the Enterprise. We had a closed-circuit television system, and I was asked to do a couple of port briefings. So that was my first exposure.
You alert people as to what the port is going to be like.
That's
you're
right.
Going to
Ports that I'd never been in myself.
I see. So someone hands you this and says,
"Well, we
read
did
it."
a lot of boning up. We did a lot of research,
right.
And that was my first exposure to television. And after, I guess I'd made in all 3 cruises with the Enterprise. When I got moved to the Air Wing staff, Sanford, Florida, there was then a very important naval air station, Sanford Naval Air Station, which was the home port for all the heavy attack squadrons that deployed to the Atlantic and Mediterranean, the 6th Fleet, 2nd and 6th Fleet. And anyway, there was a very ambitious captain there who had another star in his eye, and conscripted me to be his public information officer, having looked in my jacket and seen that I had a year of newspaper experience. And so I was moved to the wing staff, theoretically in my specialty as an air intelligence officer, but I didn't do much of that, and I did a lot of PIO work, and got to know the local media and got to know a lot of the people in the local media. That would be Orlando, Sanford area, and got a lot of experience writing and hobnobbing with people who are actually in the business. And when I came out of the Navy, it was a pretty good market for journalists. And I wound up getting a job I was still newspaper oriented. Wound up getting a job with the Sacramento Bee.
Back home.
Back home.
Yeah.
My home paper as a general assignment reporter.
So that's good because you knew the area well.
Knew the area well.
I mean, many people in journalism, particularly in radio, who will take a job in Minot, North Dakota, just to find a job.
I was offered a couple of those.
Oh, yes. Don't know how to pronounce the local names, you know. That's the worst part about it. So you're back in Sacramento. You know, the training you got in the military, whether it's print or electronic media, some of the best radio people I know came out of Armed Forces Radio.
Oh, yes. There are a lot of them still out there.
Yeah. And so the military has been an excellent training ground for a lot of journalists.
Well, look at some of the prominent names of CBS history, my alma mater's history, one of my alma mater's histories. I mean, Cronkite cut his teeth on war reporting.
And UPI. We always claim him as an alumnus.
Andy Rooney famously and proudly had credentials with
Stars and Stripes.
Stars and Stripes. And so many of the big names, the historic names in broadcasting, came out of war reporting in World War II. And I remember Bob Pierpoint, who was a White House correspondent, much beloved man, who began reporting for CBS in the Korean War. But he was a World War II veteran and had learned about the military and learned in part his craft.
So many reporters really showed their stuff going into war zones. That's an assignment I would have never taken, I don't think, had it been offered me. But I can see Walter Cronkite going back during Vietnam, you know, doing those great reports. The report he did, I think it was 31 days before Johnson said he wasn't going to run again, where he basically said to say that victory is closer today is to believe the optimists who were so wrong in the past. And he basically said we should leave not as a victor, but as an honorable people who did their best to defend democracy. And I think the story was that Johnson is with Bill Moyers, I think, watching that report and said, it's over. I can't run again. We've got to get out of here. But so Uncle Walter went over there and... But those were risky assignments. I mean, even if you were at the top echelon and maybe not exactly on the front, anything could have happened.
Oh, yeah. And some of the wars we've had recently, Iraq and Afghanistan, and those few reporters that are getting into Syria, they're working in terrifically dangerous conditions, and there's a toll to show for it.
Absolutely. There have been a lot of injuries and deaths. So you're back at the Sacramento Bee.
And this is where I accidentally get into broadcasting, because just as I was joining the Bee bought KOVR TV, a very much number 3 rated ABC affiliate. It was KOVR Channel 13, Stockton, Sacramento.
And this would have been about what year?
This would have been, they bought it, I believe, at the end of 1964, and proceeded to try to beef up what was a rather small news department, and eventually began recruiting from the newspaper. Warren Alney, who's become a fixture in this market, was one of the first to go over to KOVR and try his hand at television, very successfully, as it turned out. One of the really bright reporters at the Bee, a young reporter named Clark Biggs, went over and eventually became news director of KOVR. And finally, after I'd worked at the Bee a couple of years, I was asked if I'd like to try my hand at it. And the rest is history. I did. And very soon after I got over some of the awkward adjustments of going from a medium where I could write stories, I at that time was on the feature desk of the Bee and was writing, 1,500, 2,000 word stories, and going over into a medium where my first assignment was writing for the noon news anchor, 15-second and 30 seconds burps. Why, it was quite an adjustment. But once I made the adjustment, I loved having the additional dimensions of picture and sound, and became completely enamored with the new world of broadcasting, new world for me anyway, and wound up spending 5.5 years as state capitol correspondent for the McClatchy broadcasting chain, which included KOVR-TV in Sacramento.
David, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've always thought that there were a lot of people outside of California who really knew nothing about Sacramento unless one of the big politicians or a strong governor was in the news. But there have been in and out of the governor's mansion in Sacramento, in California politics, some major confrontations over the years that made big news here in the state.
There were epic clashes, but a lot got done through that now out-of-fashion word, compromise. And a lot of measures, a lot of the things that we take for granted today got enacted into law. The withholding on state income taxes. Reagan once famously said that his feet were in concrete on that. Some months later, after they'd worked out a big compromise, he was quoted as saying, "That sound you hear is the concrete cracking around my feet."
You know, I'm sure political analysts would go on for hours about this, but when you and I were younger, we had these stalwart, strong people on Capitol Hill in Washington, from Scoot Jackson to Everett Dirksen, Hubert Humphrey. They would pontificate for hours, but then they would go behind closed doors and compromise. I don't think you could pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 today.
I don't think so either.
You're right. There is no middle ground.
I think the question is whether you could pass a motherhood resolution.
Probably not. But that was a great era. It was a fun era, and I'm watching it, of course, from the East Coast at that time. But there were irrigation canals built, a lot of construction projects.
Yeah, just before I began covering the Capitol, I started covering the Capitol. My first story was Reagan's first inauguration, and of course he was preceded by Pat Brown.
Pat Brown,
whose proudest achievement was pushing through the State Water Project.
And the main canal is named for him.
Mm-hmm, which was, the construction on that was getting underway when I took over. And of course now it's an old story.
Yes.
In California.
And the infrastructure is crumbling already.
That's right.
Probably.
That's right.
So how long were you in that gig then in Sacramento?
5.5 years, interrupted by a half year or an academic 2 quarters back at Stanford, where I was fortunate enough to win a Stanford Professional Journalism Fellowship, now known as a Knight Journalism Fellowship, which was a back-to-school program for mid-career journalists. And I got to go back and study anything I wanted. And, I put together a proposal for urban affairs. This was during a period, this was in the late 60s. Well, the proposal was written in 1970. Proposal for, as I say, an urban affairs field of study. As you know, cities here in America were being racked by racial violence and by dissonance over the Vietnam War. And again, my timing was very lucky, because while I was at Stanford, we began getting a window into the up to that point closed world of China. And there happened to be a couple of crack China experts at Stanford. And we, back-to-school journalists, managed to put together our own little seminar series with a couple of these experts, and got a leg up on the inside scoop on China just before Kissinger made his secret trip to China, and which was historic, and which was the beginning of the great opening to China.
I would think that if you had to work in a state capital, I really can't think of any other state capital in the U.S. that can be as much a national focus, have as much a national focus thrown on it as Sacramento.
Well, yeah, you look at the history, and that's absolutely true. I mean, so many of the figures that have come through that state capital have become national figures. The first name that comes to mind is Earl Warren, of course, who was governor, very, very popular governor, who used to win on both tickets in California.
And went on to be Chief Justice.
Yeah, they had cross-filing in California at that time. And Hiram Johnson, the great reformer, who went on, he was governor of California, went on to be a U.S. senator of some note. And, of course, Reagan is, and if you become governor of California, it almost becomes axiomatic that there will be presidential prospects talk about you, as there have been about, well, there initially was about Schwarzenegger, except that there was a little small matter of his country of birth that got in the way there. But Brown at one time was, both Browns have been in the national spotlight, and Jerry Brown, of course, ran for president himself.
There's almost a close tie, I guess, with New York State. I mean, you look at the governors who've come out of New York.
Yeah, that's true.
We're talking to longtime journalist David Dow, one of the smoothest voices on CBS Radio for years. His career started in newspaper work in central northern California. He was born in an area near Sacramento and did a lot in local television and newspapers in Sacramento. But then he moved on, and I told him I would suppose, due to the proximity to San Francisco, that his next move was probably to that city.
No, the next move was to CBS News, the network news.
Wow.
And
how did that happen?
Well, it happened the long, slow, natural way. While I was at Stanford, I tired old way. I put together an audition tape. I put together a resume, and I began sending it around and peddling it around. And one of the places I took it and delivered it was the CBS Network Bureau here in Los Angeles. And lo and behold, that resulted in a callback. And a callback resulted in a couple of more interviews, and lo and behold, a job.
What did it feel like to get accepted? Because maybe it's because I worked so long at a CBS affiliate. But when I think of NBC Radio, I don't really think of much other than Toscanini. When I think of ABC, I think of sports. But when you say CBS, this flood of names from Murrow to Winston Burdett, all these, the quality of CBS News is completely, you can't debate that.
Yeah, it was commonly referred to as the Tiffany Network when I went to work there, and you felt privileged to work there. And you walked in the broadcast center on West 57th Street, and the news operation was in some ways had the feeling of a small family, except when you sat down and adjusted to the fact that there was somebody over there in the corner talking on a telex machine to bureaus in Tokyo, in Rome, in Paris, wherever. And you realized, and of course, when I first started talking to bureaus in Saigon.
Let me ask something that I hope is not boring to non-radio people. But I know pretty much how network newscasts work, having done them for 18, 19 years at UPI Radio, although this was such a shoestring operation. It was all what we call combo. You engineer, you push the tapes in, you hit the tapes, you turned everything on. Everything was done manually except the jingle, the sounder at the beginning of the newscast came from somewhere. I don't know. And I sat in on a lot of newscasts when I worked at Mutual. When you did news out of Los Angeles on CBS Radio, out of curiosity, did that lovely chime they still use and the dee-dee-dee-dee-dee come out of New York, or was it generated in Los Angeles?
The sounder came out of New York.
Okay.
In fact,
I figured everything was timed out of there.
I put on a headset. I heard the sounder, hopefully right on the hour, and started going a couple seconds into the sounder.
I don't know whether you remember this incident or not, but you did a newscast on CBS in which you didn't sound very good. I don't know whether you had choked on something, but I thought, is David okay? And then after the commercial, you didn't come back. The circuit broke or something, and I thought you'd had I was really worried. I thought you'd had a heart attack or something because you were just kind of going from bad to worse. But that's happened to all of us. I mean, you learn early. You don't eat right before you go on the air.
No, I don't remember the incident. I remember one time, racing an oncoming cough to the conclusion of the broadcast and losing the race and suddenly going hoarse and half coughing just as I was going to sign off. And Jack Salvatore at KNX, who was anchoring for KNX and on duty at that time, came back coughing. Just so it was a perfect segue.
My fascination with CBS Radio when I first visited New York was the realization that different time zones got different shows. Mm-hmm. For example, when The World Tonight was on at 6 in Eastern, at 5 o'clock in Central, Reed Collins did a newscast, and then it was a 9-minute newscast, but after the second commercial, on the West Coast, they played Correspondent's Report and cut it down to a shorter newscast. And then you had Lowell Thomas in one time zone, where you had The World Tonight and the other time zones. And I just thought, those engineers must really know what they're doing. But there was a fellow named Harry Burrell, whom I never met. And Harry did a newscast for the West Coast that I think was on CBS to cover one of those hours. And I remember being in Indiana, I would see his name on the schedule, and I thought, well, I never hear this fellow. And then a friend of mine in L.A. said, he's on the West Coast leg of CBS. So it was a neat bit of bookkeeping they had to do to get that straight.
And, well, time zones still are a factor in broadcasting. You see it's particularly obvious during the season we're in now, a campaign season. Because a lot of elections get, with modern polling, the outcome of a lot of elections occurs at the closing of polls in an eastern state, 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock Eastern time. And, of course, if it's 8 o'clock, that's 5 o'clock in the West, where the evening network television newscasts have not aired yet. So they do. You will see them doing a Western edition of the CBS Evening News or a Western edition of the NBC Nightly News. And having been involved in some of those out here, it can get a little frantic trying to patch that in. Or you have a story that breaks after the broadcast has been fed from the East, and you have to somehow shoehorn that into the broadcast, cut something out, and
they keep such good records. For example, instead of redoing the whole newscast, Cronkite would sometimes just do 4 minutes between two commercials, or redo just the lead and then go to the spot. But it all had to happen in the same time.
That's right.
That the original happened.
That's right.
So it was a horse race.
You've got a little pad at the end. I mean, you've assuming you didn't go right to the limit, there's a little pad at the end for credits, so you don't have to roll all the credits each night.
You've got a little fudge factor there.
You've got a little fudge factor there.
Yeah. I'm being an aficionado of old-time radio. You listen to some of those old NBC shows where they were still running bing, bing, bing at the end of the shows, which fired automatically. And sometimes the show, the guy will say, listen next week for Fibber, McGee, and Molly, and there's about 20 seconds worth of music. And other times you'll listen again for Johnsbury Bronson on that bong, and he's looking at the clock going, I can't make this on time. Tell us what it was like to prepare on a normal day when nothing's really breaking, to put that newscast together. Because I think people at home don't realize that there were what are called windows in newscasts. That now, for example, they have to end the first segment at precisely 3 after.
You're talking about the radio hours.
In other words, to write to time, to write a newscast that fits the window and the spots go in, and you're really writing up to several points in the newscast that you have to be there.
Well, the first time you do it, it can seem a little frightening. But very quickly, you sort of get a rhythm about it, and you build in what today is commonly referred to as a couple of plan Bs. And you, for instance, will have, in the event that somehow a tape insert, an interview segment, a soundbite doesn't roll in, and hence you don't have that 10 or 15 seconds in there, you'll have some pad copies standing by that you can read to get up to that 3-minute break. Or you always, on most newscasts, during business hours, you will go into that break at 3 minutes with the stocks. And you have several options when you get there, depending on how much time you've got. You can do the Dow Jones Industrials closed today down 3 points. Or you can go, the Dow is down 3. Or you can go, the Dow down 3. And if you need more time, you can throw in the NASDAQ.
Right, or say a lackluster day today on Wall Street with the Dow Jones Industrial. It's an accordion there.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
I remember in college, one of my fellow students in the 60s asking the professor, who was Fred Brewer, who had written for Mad Magazine before coming to Indiana University to teach journalism, of all things, why the stocks were there. And this is before the internet. I mean, now kids would say, well, nobody needs to hear stocks on radio. You just punch it up. But he said the same thing. He said it's the great accordion. You can make the stock report 2 seconds or 15, depending upon what's happening at that time. Do you remember what it felt like the first time you got through a CBS network newscast and whew, it's over?
Just exactly the way you put it. Whew, it's over.
I just know it was so much fun in those golden days at CBS when I was at an affiliate. There was a wonderful fellow named Win Elliott who was doing sports on weekends.
Oh, he was a tradition.
Yeah, and he would race right up. We supposedly got 30 seconds, for example, between the end of his sports and the beginning of a show that Alexander Kendrick did called The World This Week. And he always talked like a gangster. And if he was late, and you had to read a live commercial in that 30 seconds, but I remember he came out one day, and I'm watching the clock, and I think that's one thing we in radio do that most people don't do. We look at the clock. The clock is the Bible. I mean, it's up there on the wall. And I'm thinking, this guy's got 6 seconds left. What's he going to do? And I'm listening, and all of a sudden you hear Win Elliott say, and the Dodgers won by 2 points. Bye. And he didn't even give the lockout. He just bailed out. But he was funny. You know, even if you didn't like sports, you loved Win Elliott.
You know, there are so many of those legendary stories like that hang around the CBS hallways and the broadcast center in New York and wherever CBS is today. And one of those is that, and you hear this story when somebody makes the point that breathing comes from the diaphragm. That's where you get the oomph. That's where an opera singer gets the oomph. It comes from the diaphragm, the midsection. And there was one longtime anchor at CBS Radio, Alan Jackson. His son went on to become
Alan
a
Jackson,
longtime.
CBS News.
Yeah.
Did the evening news.
And it was said that he would, just as he would go into the booth to do the newscast, he would unbuckle his belt, unbutton the top button of his pants, so his diaphragm had more room to move.
Yeah, you know, you mentioned David Jackson, who I don't know whether he's still alive or not.
He
but
lives in Hawaii.
Really? For a while.
Don't feel sorry for David.
Oh, okay. He and his dad did every other newscast at night. And there was a time before a woman named Ann Crossman came on overnight that the 10 p.m. Eastern Time newscast was the last one. There was no, just as most TV stations signed off.
It was while I was working in New York that they went to 24-hour hourlies.
And I remember they called it was abbreviated ANN, All Night News, and the woman's name was Ann.
Ann Crossman.
Who did it. Yeah.
I remember her well.
And I must tell you a quick CBS story. We used to carry a show called The Midday Weather that Gordon Barnes in New York did. And Gordon Barnes kind of had a unique way of speaking. And I called him up one time, and he said, you like, I love the show. And he goes, no one ever calls me. So he invites me to CBS, and I remember I got there the night before Hurricane Agnes. And here is this network weathercaster who sends me out into the throat of Hurricane Agnes to drive to Washington, D.C. without telling me don't go. But he started doing promos for the station in Indiana I work for. And all of a sudden, a tape arrived, and he had Cronkite do promos for us. And he had Phil Rizzuto do promos for us. And I guess we were the only station in America that paid any attention to him. And he would always say, and listeners in southern Indiana to WAOV will have bad weather. And we got a call from the affiliate in Indianapolis one time saying, why doesn't he ever mention us? He's always mentioning this little town. But we were kind of his groupies, I guess, there. But Is there any other industry where there are more war stories?
Well, I don't know. I've never worked in any other industry.
I haven't either, but I can't imagine.
But, people ask do I miss the news business now that I'm retired from it? And my answer is, well, I don't miss the herky-jerkiness of it. The life of a network correspondent involves a lot of travel, and a lot of travel with no notice, and you can't really say when you go to work in the morning where you're going to sleep that night. And it's tough on family life, and it can get to be quite a haul. But what I do miss is the newsroom camaraderie and the banter and the trading of war stories and all that goes with that newsroom ambience and environment.
Well, you're in the midst, and it was the same way when I was at the UPI newsroom here in L.A. You're in the midst of a lot of people with a common background who are very well educated, have great memories, and it's like being in Jeopardy, the TV show Jeopardy, because the kibitzing between people in a newsroom is at such an interesting level. It's psychologically stimulating to work in a newsroom. Yeah.
Oh, it is. It is, and you plus the fact you're working with people who have a lot of talent too. And,
yes.
And I was always amazed at the unique gifts of some of the people I worked with, and I see that the evening news is now dipping back to Charles Kuralt, who was, in my mind, maybe the best writer. Apart from being a wonderful broadcaster and storyteller, he was a wonderful writer. But they are now doing Hartman, who has taken over that on the road segment, is now doing updates on some of the stories.
Going back and revisiting those people? Wow.
Visiting people that Kuralt did stories on back in the 60s and 70s.
Charles Osgood told me that second only to a death in the family did he get the news of Kuralt's death. He knew he was in the wings to take over the Sunday show. And I didn't realize how sick Kuralt was there at the end. He said there was a doctor there who practically propped him up during the commercials. I mean, he had lupus and a lot of other things wrong with him. But I think Kuralt's writing, and I remember one report he did from his grandmother's home or something in the Carolinas, and he has that beautiful voice, and he's talking about how he and his brother used to come out and eat cake on the porch, and one of their favorite things was to go in the old swimming hole, which was right across the unpaved road from his grandmother's, and they swing the camera around, and there's a Walmart there. Never will forget that. David, I need to ask you one other thing. The last time we did an interview, it was after you had written a book called Cameras in the Courtroom. Tell us a little bit about how the thought of that came and your feelings about that issue now.
Well, and that's still an evolving subject. We thought we were timely at the time, but it continues to be a timely topic as discussion is revived over whether the U.S. Supreme Court should invite cameras in to cover its proceedings. But the story evolved quite simply from covering the O.J. Simpson murder trial. And my co-author, who was a consultant that CBS was using at that time, she and I were talking during a lull in court proceedings, and as you'll recall in that trial, why the camera and the televising of that began to play a role of its own and began to have a life of its own as the trial unfolded. And we just discussed the whole issue, the whole role the camera had played there, and one thing led to another, and we decided that it was time somebody wrote a book about the issue of cameras in the courtroom. And so we began doing interviews, actually, before the trial was over. Some of the people we wanted to interview were there covering the trial, and were doing some consulting work themselves. And it came together. My co-author, Marjorie Cohn, is a law professor in San Diego at Thomas Jefferson Law School. I, of course, was based here in Los Angeles. And so after the trial was over and we weren't seeing each other face-to-face much, why we would spend a lot of time on the telephone exchanging ideas and and thoughts on what we were doing. And then we'd send pages back and forth for each other to critique. And
it finally coalesced.
And it coalesced.
Yeah.
And it turned out our backgrounds complemented one another. I've never been to law school in my life. I've never spent a day in law school in my life. And she's a fairly prominent expert in some aspects of particularly criminal law. And I had the journalistic background that could take her legalese excesses and convert them to readable English. And she has gone on to write several books on her own.
You know, I covered the second Simpson trial outside. Did not have access to the inside, and it was a true stakeout. I'm out there with about $2 million worth of television cameras, counted it up one day, waiting for somebody to come out of the building. And friends say, "You covered the Simpson trials?" I said, "Yeah, it was the most boring, just sitting out there." So what I would do is I would listen to KNX. And when you guys broke something on the air, I would rush up with my microphone and try to figure out who's coming out of the courtroom. But stakeouts can be deadly.
Oh, of course they are.
Oh, Lord, yeah.
Oh, they are.
And trials, if you don't enjoy them, can be a horrible thing to cover. Worse than a city council meeting.
Or they can get addictive. And I worried for a time there was such a string of them that I was covering. There were actually 3 Rodney King beating trials.
Yes.
And I covered all 3 of those. I covered 2 Simpson trials. I was in and out of there were 2 Menendez brothers trials during that period, and I was sort of hitting highlights of those. So I was spending a lot of time in a courtroom. I probably spent more time in a courtroom than many attorneys have, who are not day-by-day trial attorneys. And I worried at times that I was getting addicted to the process and getting addicted to the atmospherics, but the news business always is full of sharp turns and changes. And just about the time I began to worry about that, why the news diet took an entirely different direction.
David, now let me ask you one final question. If you could go back to any day in your career, whether it had pathos or was the most exhilarating or whatever, or one story, where would you like to go back to?
Boy, that's a tough one.
I'm not sure I can answer it about myself even, but it just occurs to me, did you have a favorite, favorite job? Maybe that would be
I'll
better.
tell you, I think the answer is the images of a story I covered quite a long time ago have never left me for very negative reasons. I happened to get sent into Thailand. I'd originally been sent over to Asia from here to cover another story which didn't come through. And it was while you're there, we've got all these Cambodians streaming across the border into Thailand, all these refugees. And refugees were streaming out of Cambodia across the border into Thailand. I got sent down to cover that. I have never seen such human misery and suffering in my life.
David, finally, if I can segue from that type of misery to another, you recently have been associated with some great work in L.A., downtown, inner city, at the Los Angeles Rescue Mission. Tell us about that.
I'll be glad to tell you about that. I am still board chairman of the Union Rescue Mission. It is, through the recession, it has served record numbers of people. In the year 2010, we served 1.3 million meals, over 1 million meals. We have, one of the things that's happened during my time on the board is we have expanded off Skid Row and acquired and developed a facility, former multi-level retirement home in a beautiful wooded area in Sylmar, just out of Sylmar. That's become our Hope Gardens Family Center, which is a place for women with children and also senior women, where they can go through a time of transition and a time of developing skills and the health to move on to productive lives.
David, thank you for joining us.
Well, Dennis, my privilege and pleasure. Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for going back into the archives with me. I'm Dennis Daly. See you next time, right here on YouTube.